Welcome to the Low Countries Radio, a collaboration between Republic of Amsterdam Radio and the Low Countries website, celebrating Flemish and Dutch history and culture and its impact on the world today.
Hello and welcome to the Low Countries Radio. My name is Julian Smith. On a bright and sunny Sunday morning at the end of October 2024, my podcasting colleague Joe Wegasani and I met outside a large and imposing dark brick building in the centre of Amsterdam called De Basel. Built in the 1920s, De Basel stretches an entire city block in Amsterdam's Canal Ring between the Herengracht and the Keizersgracht. It is a magnificent example of an architectural style known as brick expressionism. It exudes grandeur and wealth, which is appropriate given that it was originally built as the headquarters of the Netherlands Trading Society, sometimes referred to as the successor of the Dutch East India Company. Later on, De Basel served as the main office of ABN AMRO Bank. Since 2007, however, the building has housed the Stadsarchief Amsterdam, the Amsterdam City Archive. The Amsterdam City Archive is one of the largest municipal archives in the world, with over 50 kilometres of shelves inside, housing so much of the documented history of the city. We had chosen to visit the City Archive not just for a fun outing, but because it was a special day. On October 27 each year, a particularly precious parchment is taken out of the dark depot in which it is usually stored to be put on display for one day only to the general public. We entered the building expecting to see throngs of tourists, and although it was busy, it was relatively calm and peaceful inside. We headed towards the so-called treasure room, which is in the basement, and was originally the safe deposit of the Netherlands Trading Society. After descending some stairs, we passed through 70-centimetre thick vault doors and stopped to admire the view. The space in the treasure room was breathtaking. A 2-story pillared room covered in intricately patterned tile mosaics in blue, yellow, white, green, brown, and black. And there, at the bottom of the stairs, was an unassuming glass box containing a surprisingly small document with a large wax seal attached. This is what we had come to see. Known as the toll exemption privilege, it is the oldest written text in the Amsterdam City Archive collection, which actually mentions Amsterdam as a place. The text is written in Latin but reads as follows in English. Quote, Count Floris of Holland declares that from now on all inhabitants of Amsterdam are exempt from paying tolls for the transportation of their goods throughout our territory. This is to compensate them for the damage caused to them by our troops. As proof of this, we have validated this document with our seal, issued in Leiden on the Sunday before the feast day for the apostles Saints Simon and Jude in the year of our Lord 1275. End quote. Dated October 27, 1275, the toll exemption privilege marks the beginning of the written history of Amsterdam. So October 27 has become known as the birthday of the city. The Sunday we visited was the 749th birthday of Amsterdam and marked the official kickoff of the 750-year jubilee, which the city will celebrate over 12 months with all sorts of large-scale events. The next day, we returned to the Amsterdam City Archive to interview Erik Schmitz, a senior curator there, to speak to him about the toll exemption privilege. We met him in the Wagenaarkamer, a large wood-panelled room on the second floor with a big wooden table in its centre. It was definitely the most impressive room this podcast has ever been recorded in. In our conversation, we discussed a wide range of topics, covering what the toll privilege actually is, the physical history of it, how it has survived all these years, the way the document has been regarded by the general public and how that has changed over time, and the part that it has played in shaping how Amsterdammers see themselves and their city. Erik was a passionate and precise man, and we could have happily listened to him speaking for hours. We thoroughly enjoyed our time together, and we hope you enjoy listening to it too. So, let's get into it and speak to Erik Schmitz.
Erik Schmitz, thank you very much for joining us. Could you please just introduce yourself?
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm working at the Amsterdam City Archives. I'm a senior curator, And my work is doing research in our archive, but also making exhibitions and writing publications.
When did you start working with the City Archive?
I started in 1994, but before that I was a regular visitor, so I know the archive quite well.
Okay, we want to talk about the toll privilege. Could you tell us a little bit about it, who gave it, who got it, what it means, and why it is significant?
Yeah. Well, it was granted by the Count of Holland, Floris V, in 1275 on the 27th of October. That's why this is the starting of a jubileum year, but next year on the 27th of October, Amsterdam will be 750 years old. Now, I will come to that later. And Floris V was he was a count, but he was a medieval sovereign who was really looking at opportunities. And Amsterdam at the time was, we would say a village. We probably had about 1,000 inhabitants, about 200 houses or so. And it was not in the County of Holland, but this was this part of the lands of the Bishop of Utrecht. But it was very much near the frontier of Holland and Utrecht. And Amsterdam was also along an already developing trading route coming from the north and leading through Holland. So Floris V was very keen trying to expand his territory, and this granting of this toll privilege was just one, so you could say it was a kind of pawn move on a bigger chessboard, and there were lots of other pieces around, so it's only a small move. But for Amsterdam, it was a significant move. And what does it say, this toll privilege? It gives, this document, it gives the Amsterdammers exemption of toll in the County of Holland for their own goods. These tolls were at the edge of the county, so there were not inland tolls, but actually at the edge. So when you entered, and this one toll at Spaarndam, for example, then you had to pay toll over your goods. And when you left the county, it's somewhere near Dordrecht, you had either you could show you already paid or you had to pay. So that meant for the Amsterdammers after 1275 that either an Amsterdam shipper, if he had his own goods in his, but usually it was by ship, of course, because the roads were really bad. He could show, he did show a copy, of course. He didn't took the original one. Otherwise, there would be a lot of quarrels who could have the original one. But also, and that's also really important, it was not obliged to be an Amsterdam shipper. It could be a shipper from Frisia or so on as well, if only he could show that the goods in his ship were owned by an Amsterdammer.
Okay.
And of course, and we'll come to it probably later, the historical identity of Amsterdam is very much about trade and being a trading city. And this privilege is about trade. Such a toll exemption was given to other places as well at the time, so Amsterdam is not really special in this respect. But from an Amsterdam point of view, it's just the starting point of being very small, but already trade being a key point.
Okay, at this point I'm going to jump in just to set some context. Floris V's father, Willem II, had been an extremely influential and powerful nobleman, not only in the Low Countries, but also in a wider European view. As well as being Count of Holland and Zeeland, Willem II had been elected King of the Romans in the 1240s and could potentially have become Holy Roman Emperor had his life not come to a premature end. In 1256, he was battling against the Frisians at a place called Hoogwoud when he and his horse fell through some ice and he was slain. Willem's son, Floris V, was just 2 years old at the time. By the time Floris was 12, he was declared old enough to rule in his own right. One of the first things he had in mind was to avenge his father's death. In 1272, Floris V invaded Friesland, but was himself ignominiously defeated. Unlike his father, however, he lived to see another day. In that same year, farmers and peasants in the Kennemer region of Holland went into revolt against Floris and the nobility in Holland, probably unhappy with being burdened by taxes they saw as unfair. They were led in this uprising by an ambitious lower noble named Gijsbrecht van Amstel. They attacked castles and put the town of Haarlem to siege, but the revolt was eventually quashed. Displaying good political sense, Floris V placated the angry farmers with fairer legal regulations and taxes. In addition to this, Floris also gave special privileges to towns which had suffered damage during the uprising. The toll exemption privilege granted to Amsterdam was one of those. So how exactly did this piece of parchment come to be, and how has it survived so long? Let's get back to Erik Schmitz.
It was issued at Leiden, actually, and the count was traveling around in his own county, and this has to do with justice, but also because the economy was not that much developed, so he traveled around and the harvest was in different places, so he more or less moved, and when everything was eaten up, to say it very simple, then he moved to another place.
Of course.
So probably, but we don't know for sure, some more important Amsterdammers in 1275 went to Leiden, and they got this privilege. It was written by Meester Allarts van Middelburg. He was probably at the time the only writer in the what's called the Kanselarij. It's the administrative part of the county. He wrote the text. It's written on parchment, which was made from a goat. And parchment is very durable material. It can survive for centuries. The more fragile thing is actually the ink. So the ink will gradually fade away if it has got too much daylight. That's why we keep it in our depot in the dark and also in very stable condition like humidity and temperature. But at the time, the Amsterdammers probably kept it in a chest, and we know there was a smithy was excavated, a 13th century smithy, and one of the products that a smith made were actually keys and locks. So we know for sure there were locks either on houses or on chests. Later on in medieval times, in the second half of the 15th century, they made a special archival chest, which is actually in our treasure room of the archive. It was dated by the 3 rings, by dendrochronology of the small drawers. And the toll privilege was kept in one of these drawers. And to put it in these drawers, it was actually folded. It was folded 3 times, which was quite usual in these regions. And what you do, actually, you fold it once, and then you protect the written text. And then you fold the seal again, and then you have actually 2 flaps that protect the seal. So you have a very small kind of envelope. And on the back, you write what's inside very shortly.
Yeah, now that I look at the image of it, you can see the fold lines.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So at one point in time, I just printed the photograph, and I took a scissor, and then I to fold it back again.
Wow.
Yeah. At the beginning of the 16th century, this archival chest was already placed in the old church of Amsterdam, which is still there as a building. It's actually the oldest church. It was a brick building, which is very safe for fire. And at the beginning of the 16th century, they made a special archival vault, which is about 4 meters above floor level. So it was also protected against floods. If Amsterdam would be flooded, probably not 4 meters of water. And then something else that's very medieval, I guess, such a building is also, it's a religious building. It's protected, it's a special space, and it's protected also by the relics of the saints that are there. So it's quite a thing to break in such a building. And you wouldn't do that that's quite a thing. And it was there with some other, let's say, about 300 of these kind of privileges until 1992, actually.
Wow.
And we would say, well, you need this privilege because you have it shown now and then. But what they actually did, they wrote the text that were in this privilege, not the only toll exemption, in books. Okay. And what we can see in about 25 of those books that survived, handwritten, of course, the most important families in Amsterdam that were also in the city council and so on, they had in their family had such a book. And maybe you could say for their own safekeeping, because they know the text, but their enemies, they had such a book as well. So you couldn't say, well, the text is like this or that, because you knew they had the text as well. And also in the city hall were such books. So if they wondered what is this privilege about, they could look up the book. And only once a generation, sometimes only in 2 generations, they went to the special vault, and you needed 2 keys to get in the vault, and then 3 keys to get in this archival chest.
And can I ask who had the keys?
Yeah, the keys, we know the keys of the chest, they were kept by 3 different people who worked at in the city council or either in the town hall. And then in the second half of the 17th century, they felt it wasn't really practical. So what they did, they had a small box in the treasury in the city hall, where they kept 3 keys, but this box also had 3 keys. But the whole idea is, it's really dangerous to have one person with 1 key, because look at modern politics. If one person has lots of power, he can change laws and so on. And so it is really important that also when they visited this vault, it was usually the mayors were there and some other people, just to see that everything went right.
So between the different keys and the books with the copies, and I imagine the count would have also had a book.
No, well, I don't know. We have to judge from what survives.
Sure.
And we know for sure, well, there was this registration thing where only one guy worked at the time, this is Meester Allards, and he traveled with the count through the county. But we don't have any proof that there was a copy in the archive of the count. We don't even know if there was registration of the grants that were given. That's only later on. If you come in the 14th century, then you have books that they wrote down what rights were given to, and so on and so forth. But then this is about the introduction of written documents. So from oral history to written history, which you see actually what happens probably in the 12th century starting, and in the 13th year it becomes more general. And the second step is, of course, growing into a registration. So, and we think of it as normal that you have a civic registration and you know where people live and so on. But that has to develop. So, the few things we know about the times of Floris V in this respect, I can say he didn't have a copy, and I doubt if he had a real registration.
Because of course there was dynastic change with the counts. So, for instance, when the Burgundians took over, it must have been a concern for these towns.
Oh yeah, but that is another thing. You have this original document of 1275. But the city of Amsterdam was very keen to have it recognized again and again and again. So we have a second toll exemption document from 1292, which was also issued by Floris V. And but at the time, Floris V had already gained more power, and what it says is more or less the same as the older one, but for the city it was important to have it again recognized as a right. And then, of course, when it moved to het Henegouwse Huis and so on, then every now and then it was recognized by the new sovereign.
We'll be back after this short break.
So you mentioned earlier about that transition from oral history to written history, because what makes this document so special is that it's the first time that the name Amsterdam is mentioned in a written legal text. It's because it's often referred to as the birth of Amsterdam. Most other cities that I know of celebrate their being given city rights as their foundation. But for Amsterdam, that happened slightly later. Is that correct?
Yeah, we know it by a copy. So the city rights were granted either in 1300 or in 1301. The original is lost. It was probably taken from the Amsterdammers because they revolted against the bishop in 1303. This copy says something about the bishop, so we can put it on these 2 years, but we even don't know the date. And of course, when you are a city, that's a different status, so that will be a reason to have a special year. The second city right Amsterdam is 1342. That the original survives, it's in our archive as well. But since the toll exemption privilege is the oldest record that mentions Amsterdam, and it's in our archive, if you have to choose, you choose that one.
Sure.
Yeah.
It makes sense. From my understanding, it was also because Floris V was killed, of course.
Yeah.
Did the toll privilege survive that event?
Yeah. Because Amsterdam wasn't involved in the murder of Floris V. Only when Amsterdam revolted because, the son of Gijsbert van Amstel, who is actually involved in this murdering Floris V, he had to flee, but his son came back and the Amsterdammers let him in the city, and they were punished for that, so they lost their city rights, and probably the toll privilege and the city rights were taken by the Bishop of Utrecht. We don't know for sure, and they got their toll privilege back, and the city rights far later on. And then the toll privilege was always kept in Amsterdam in a special vault. And then after the French Revolution, and also when this revolution was spread through Europe and in the end came to the Dutch Republic as well, these old rights from the medieval times, they stopped. So the toll exemption was valid up till 1795. And of course, Amsterdam traders used this.
Sure.
Yeah.
I bet.
Yeah. And then, of course, there are lots of changes. Napoleon got civic registration. It's actually a new time. Times are beginning. Even at one point in time, the Dutch Republic becomes part of France. Actually, and then in 1813, it becomes a kingdom. And we know during the time that the French occupied the Dutch Republic, they kept this vault very secret and silent because they were afraid everything would be taken to Paris, like they did with paintings and so on.
Okay.
So they were aware that it was there, and they said, "Well, we just don't say anything, don't mention it." And then what you see during the 20s in the 19th century, they very much regard it as an historical archive. So it's the time of the antiquarians who start collecting things. There are lots of religious art is on the market because it comes from all these monasteries and churches that were pillaged during the French Revolution. And there are already some publications. And then in 1848, actually, our first Amsterdam archivist, he wrote about the Iron Chapel, as this vault is called, and about the toll exemption privilege. And what he actually felt at the time, the people who looked at it from an historical point of view, they were really amazed by the condition of all these old documents and the seals that were more or less felt that if they were made yesterday. And that because they were kept so much in a room that was never, hardly anyone came, especially now after 1600. We can reconstruct that before 1600 every now and then. They put a new privilege in this, and sometimes they took one out. They took it to the city hall. Some were put back again. They stayed at the city hall, but being there in a very stable condition, so ideal archival depot actually from our point of view. And then what you see, and this is a kind of 19th century development, but because you could say that Amsterdam started to look back at its history when it became a real important kind of metropolis in the 17th century, a world trading hub, and then you see the first big histories that were written by people about the history of Amsterdam. But what they say from the beginnings that we don't know how Amsterdam started. It was lost in the mist of time, and probably were fishermen and so on. And also what they also say, we don't have any documents, and this toll privilege was mentioned, but only as becoming part of Holland. That's what felt important.
The 27th of October is now seen as this very important date, but then, like you've just suggested, it wasn't always the case. No. Has there ever been any other date which people have kind of seen as a very important Amsterdam day other than October 27?
No, I wouldn't say there is one date that has survived or went through the ages. You see, most festivities are built around community feelings. And you have also keep in mind that it was a very religious society, not just the Middle Ages, but also after the Middle Ages. So the main festivities were religious. So in the Middle Ages is what's called sacramentsprocessie. The sacrament was taken in a procession through the city. That's the main festivity where everyone participated or stood along the route and looked at this, and you get all these city registration that they shouldn't sell drink and so on, not during the procession at least.
So, like on the 27th of October, 1276, no one was celebrating. Hooray, we've had this for 1 year. And 1277, probably not. So when did people really first begin celebrating that date?
In my opinion, that comes from the 19th century. Then you get a more civic society. And if you look back, when there's really celebrating this date, I guess the first time is in 1876. It's a year, they were a year later. But things happen, and it was the same year as the North Sea Canal was actually opened for this. It was a nice year, and they had some festivities. They also very first big historical exhibition in what's today Oudemannerspoort. It's very cramped, and lots of paintings and other objects that they showed were actually loaned. They were by private owners. The toll exemption document was shown there as well. As it was actually in a section that was called merkwaardige gebeurtenissen, which means
notable happenings.
Yeah, merkwaardig is also strange or kind of exceptional things that happened. But you see, it was pinned on this year. But that's actually the first time that you really see it happening. You can also see that 50 years before that, Amsterdam was really poor and they had lots of other things to worry about. Yeah. And this 1876, they were aware they were at the edge of being vibrant and being an important port again, or more or less important port. And then every 50 years it was celebrated. That's what you see. In 1925, there was also a big historical exhibition in the Rijksmuseum, which of course then existed because in 1876 there wasn't a Rijksmuseum, nor hardly any normal museum around, which of course the museum also an invention from the 19th century, at least in as we know today. And this historical exhibition in 1925 was about the whole history of Amsterdam, which was 50 years before also. Dus the toll privilege was only part with other documents of the Middle Ages, but they, especially 25, was all about the Golden Age, about 17th century, about Rembrandt was the main guest, you could say. And 1975, you see already a shift. There was an exhibition in Amsterdam Museum about archaeology, which had been in the city for about 15, 20 years. They also showed the toll privilege, but in context of 13th, some 12, more, especially 13th, 14th century objects or shirts. You could say with knowing more about medieval history, which is also a process, and more studies have been done, we understand more. And archaeology has been really important, not only to look at objects from the 13th century, as an archaeologist, to look how they were made and so on, but also how houses were built, how the whole settlement was laid out. And that kind of has put a light on this 13th century. It was always very misty and muddy. People thought about in that kind of terms. And that has also, I guess, changed the toll privilege. It has become, it's not just on its own. If you look at this times 1275, it was the only surviving thing. If you talk about Amsterdam. Yeah. So you had to do with it, and sometimes you could feel it's a kind of lonely document actually. Yeah. So, and now it has this company of all this archaeological material.
Why is that important for a modern city like Amsterdam today? And as over the next year, we're celebrating this 750 years, and it's telling us like this is our identity as a city. But that's only been informed by all the work that you're talking about in the previous decades, archaeological work. And so why does that matter? Why should Amsterdamers care about it?
Yeah, well, you can answer that in different ways. I would also argue that if we're 50 years along, we would probably look different at 13th century. If you look at Amsterdam or the identity of Amsterdam, I would say it's very much a 17th century city. Rembrandt is the big thing. If you go to the Rijksmuseum, you have what's called the Herengalerij, the main hall, and then in the end you get a night watch. And of course, today there's much more attention on the dark sides of the 17th century. Of course, they were there, but every time has its dark sides. But if you look at expansion and economical growth, and so also immigration, because Amsterdam is a real immigration city, it was where lots of people could gain from that. Even if you were a poor immigrant in Amsterdam in the 17th century, you had the possibility to make a living and to become a citizen and so on, especially in the first half. It was a really dynamic city. And it has left us with lots of beautiful buildings like the modern palace on Dam Square that get inside. Don't look at the outside, get inside. Then you really see the wealth of the 17th century. And also the canal zone, of course, the whole layout of Amsterdam, the buildings, although they changed a bit, some from the outside. The whole feeling of Amsterdam as an open city. I've experienced it quite often. If you're someone else in the world and people ask you, where do you come from? You say, I come from Amsterdam. They either say, oh, I've been there and it's great, or they say, I've never been there, but it's great because... And this being a main world trading center still works on. And I guess we have to keep the good things from the 17th century, just being an open city and
absolutely,
and being open to immigrants as well, and being creative and so on. That's what we really should take from the 17th century, and care for beautiful things as well. I guess about the tall privilege is also about caring for your history, and why is an archive important. Maybe at the core is people always want to know why do things exist? What is this start of everything? And that goes for photography. People want to know what's the first photograph we know, and why did it's also about invention, and it's also about the sense of a place. So when you're in Amsterdam, you're thinking, but how did it start? Where did it start? Why did people came here? And we know from archaeology it started somewhat earlier. But being the first document that actually mentions Amsterdam, and also in a certain way, so it says the people, you can translate it in several ways, but you can translate it in the people that live near the dam in the Amstel. I guess it's important in that respect. It tells you something about the beginning, the very humble beginning, but people, well, like you and me, they had the same intelligence. They had probably not that abundant supply of food as we have. They didn't have that kind of education, but they were also making a living. And then what I really like, of course, working at the City Archive, it was always kept in Amsterdam, and they built a special archival chest for this with all the documents. They kept it in a special vault, and then we keep it in our depots. And this is very much about caring for the communities, that we work for the community of Amsterdam, but also for everyone else in the world who's interested in Amsterdam. And we care for this document, but not for ourselves, but to give it to the people who come after us. And we hope that they will care for it and they will give it to other people. It's very much about, you're just a small part of a chain that goes back 750 years ago to 1275.
Erik's explanation for why October 27 is a date which should be remembered and celebrated by Amsterdammers was touching. Imagining an unbroken chain of people who have lived along the banks of the Amstel River and have worked here, loved here, died here, fought here, dug canals, hammered in piles, built buildings, painted pictures, hid themselves in secret annexes, or partied in fluorescent orange, all while caring for and passing down to the next generation this small little parchment with a big seal on it, which for the first time mentions them in writing. But to be honest, to me personally, the 750-year celebration does feel like an arbitrary anniversary. Archaeological work shows that the settlement which became Amsterdam had existed well before 1275. By that year, it was already a village with around 1,000 inhabitants. The dam in the Amstel had definitely already been built before the privilege was written, and surely the construction of that dam could also mark the birth of the town. So to finish up, we couldn't help but ask Erik if there might not be any other older document which exists, which, although it might not mention the name Amsterdam, could also potentially lay claim to being the beginning of Amsterdam.
There's also a document that mentions the Amstel, or the word Amstel actually, and that dates from 1105. And that's the oldest document that's about a region. It's actually connected to a name. It's a document. It's about it's a quarrel about a church or church things in the southern part of Holland. But there are lots of witnesses, and one of witness is the it says Wolfgerus Cultatus de Amestello. He is you could say the sheriff of Amstel, and Amstel is the region on the borders of the river Amstel. So the region is named after the river. And of course, Amsterdam started being a settlement in this region. And being the Amstel being part of the name of Amsterdam you could also go back to this, but we don't have that at the archive. It's in the archive of the bishops in Utrecht. Yeah, you can't have everything.
Well, on that note, I would like to say thank you very much for your time, Erik, and I wish you all the best for the 750-year celebration.
My pleasure, and come back in 50 years.
Do you want to know more about Flemish and Dutch history and culture? Visit www.the-low-countries.com. This podcast is made by Republic of Amsterdam Radio.